The Chicago Blackhawks have announced they are going through a full and complete rebuild. What does that mean for the future of their core veteran players like Jonathan Toews, Patrick Kane, and Duncan Keith? Could they be on a move sometime soon? We'll discuss their futures, and we also have some updates concerning the Edmonton Oilers and the New Jersey Devils. We'll jump into all the latest coming up next. So welcome back to another video here at Top Shelf Hockey. Now, as I mentioned, we have a lot to talk about today. Before we get into the Chicago Blackhawks rebuild and what their core players might be looking at here for their futures, let's jump into a few other quick updates concerning teams like Edmonton and New Jersey. Now, in the case of the Edmonton Oilers, we reported a while back that it looked as though Nugent Hopkins was likely going to be staying with the Oilers on a longer-term extension, but things have been quiet on that front here really ever since. We kind of got the idea that maybe they were getting close to coming to an agreement, but at this point it seems as though negotiations are still taking place and things are still progressing towards that, and it really shouldn't be too much of an issue to get it done. Not sure exactly what kind of terms we're looking at, but we're probably looking at a longer term, anywhere from 6 to 8 years for the former first overall selection. I'm not sure exactly what the AAV is going to be as of yet, but it does look like Nugent Hopkins will likely be a long-time Edmonton Oiler, possibly even end his career there, depending on how everything goes here over the course of the next several years. But he should be a core piece there along with McDavid and Draisaitl as they hopefully get into a mode here where they have a chance to contend for an extended period of time. Now, of course, in other Oilers news as well, they are still wanting to add a defenseman here to have a little bit more experience and depth on the blue line. Obviously, they want to make room for a lot of their younger D. I fully suspect we're going to see guys like Caleb Jones get more of an opportunity this year. We saw Ethan Bear take on a bigger role last year, and that should only continue to grow. Darnell Nurse is still relatively young, but certainly one of the more experienced younger D that they have, certainly taking on a bigger role as well. And of course, with the news that Oscar Klefbom is going to miss at least a big chunk of the season, possibly even the entire season, that means they can place him on long-term injury reserve for the salary cap relief so that they can make some other additional moves here to have that flexibility, and at the same time, add some more much-needed depth to kind of somewhat replace what he brings. Now, I know heading into the NHL offseason, there was a lot of talk that the Oilers could trade one or two defensemen to really shake things up back there, and at this point, nothing has materialized. So, could they still possibly move a D? It's possible, but I think it's less likely than before, knowing that Klefbom won't be there. So, I think a guy like Adam Larsson, who was under that trade speculation as well, probably remains at this point. If anybody were to be moved, it probably would be defender Chris Russell, who's down to 1 year left on his contract. Although that probably would be difficult to do, because I'm not really sure there's much of a market out there for that kind of defenseman right now. But if the market did open up, I think that's something the Oilers would consider. But I do expect guys like Broberg or Evan Bouchard to get some opportunity this year as well. And they're scouring the market, trying to see through free agency or through trade if they can add another veteran defenseman back there to add some extra stability. Now, when it comes to the New Jersey Devils, there is some talk around forward Kyle Palmieri. Now, Pierre LeBrun reports that at this point, it seems as though Palmieri, who's entering the final year of his contract, wants to stay, sign an extension, and remain with the Devils longer term. He feels it's a good fit and doesn't seem to have a desire to move on. However, they still have to hammer out an extension, and contract talks and negotiations are underway to do just that. But of course, you never know how those negotiations are going to go. It's probably fair to say that before the season started, or heading into the beginning part of this year before the pause happened, he was probably looking at a similar contract to a player, maybe like a James Van Riemsdyk, a 7-year deal, maybe around $35 million, something to that effect. But obviously things have changed quite drastically. And the Devils are one of the teams, though, that do have more of an ability to pay. Obviously, they have more flexibility cap-wise than many teams around the NHL. But they've also have to factor in that they do have some younger players and more coming through here that are going to be needing raises in the next few years' time. And they want to make sure they have all the flexibility in the world that they need to be able to do that. So they have to kind of balance things out. So at this point, I do expect Palmieri, who's been involved in trade rumors quite a bit, to likely sign an extension and stay, but you just never know. If those talks do not progress well, I would think that there's a real possibility he could be traded before the season starts, just because obviously there'd be more value and somebody having him for an entire season. And if that doesn't happen, you could see him be one of the potential top rental pieces at the NHL trade deadline. But again, there's not a lot of teams right now with a lot of space. Everybody's trying to figure out a way to free up some money to make other moves, and it's kind of a clogged up trade market. So we'll see what happens in that regard for New Jersey. But Palmieri, good possibility he signs and stays. Now, the biggest news of the day, though, was the statement from the Chicago Blackhawks. Now, we already seen word through the Blackhawks social media accounts. We knew they were going to be making some sort of announcement today. We just didn't know exactly when and exactly what it was going to be. Now, we get the letter from the Blackhawks to their fans outlining here basically the fact that they're committed to doing a full rebuild. So I'm just going to read through a couple little excerpts here from the letter, so I'll show it to you here on the screen in case you haven't had a chance to check it out already. Basically, it says to the Blackhawks fans that they're recently had to say goodbye to a pair of popular two-time champions, obviously acquired some other players via trade, and they understand it was tough to see those players, well-respected veterans, go, and realize you may have some questions about the team's direction. And it goes on to say, we're committed to developing young players and rebuilding our roster. We want more than another window to win. We want to reach the summit again and stay there, an effort that will require a stockpile of emerging talent to complement our top players. The influx of youth and their progression will provide roster flexibility and depth throughout our lineup. And I also seen comments from Stan Bowman through an ESPN interview that he conducted afterwards, where he basically said top to bottom, they just don't have enough strong players to compete. They have some great players, some good players. They're just not deep enough and strong enough, he doesn't feel, to really compete with many teams in the Western Conference, to really have a shot at being a consistent playoff team and having any shot at contending. And I must say, I do agree with him. The Blackhawks do have some great players. They do have some great prospects as well, but they're not necessarily a team that's in a position right now where they can really contend or even be a solid playoff team. If you look at the fact that they did get into playoffs last year based on the expanded format, that was great, but can they do it again, and can they continue to do it with this group of core players? So the big question amongst all this is, obviously they're finally embracing a rebuild, which many of us have said that Bowman and the Blackhawks probably should have done as much as a couple years ago, really. But they have Jonathan Toews, you have Patrick Kane, you have Duncan Keith. I mean, Brent Seabrook, to a lesser degree, was a big part of their championships, but he's at a point in his career where injuries have taken over. His value was low. He's got an albatross of a contract, and clearly he's not something that the Hawks can really move on from. It's really unclear what his future holds, but that's a whole different perspective at this point. But when you have Jonathan Toews and Patrick Kane, who are still playing at a relatively high level, and you get Duncan Keith, yes, he's diminished a bit. He's not the same defenseman he used to be, but I still think he can have some value as well. Now, all three of those players have a full no-move clause and will completely control their destiny as whether or not they remain with the Blackhawks for the remainder of their contracts or if they do get moved. Now, at this point, Stan Bowman has indicated that he has not gone to them and asked them to waive, and that they have not come to him and said that they wanted to be traded. Now, he also said he was quite surprised by the comments from Jonathan Toews not that long ago, obviously after we saw the Brandon Saad trade, and after we got confirmation that Corey Crawford was not coming back. Captain Jonathan Toews was very outspoken in an interview with The Athletic and said he was basically blindsided by the direction of the team, and that he and some of his teammates come to camp every year. It's supposed to be in the best shape, ready to compete, ready to win championships. And this is just, totally surprised by him, and then not something he's seen coming. Well, Bowman went on to indicate that he was surprised by those comments from Toews, that he felt that players like him should have had a good sense of where the team was going based on, conversations that they had during the season and even during exit interviews, etc. So I'm not sure exactly what all went on behind the scenes, but it's fair to say Captain Toews was not overly pleased with the direction. So with that in mind, you can't help but wonder, will they want to remain and be Blackhawks for their entire careers, or will they want to have that desire to continue competing for championships? If so, they may have to move on. Now, the tricky part here is, like I mentioned, not only do they have a no-move clause, but they make a lot of money, and in today's market, that's just going to be incredibly difficult to do. Now, as I mentioned, Duncan Keith has 3 years left. He's at $5.5 million. To me, he might be one of the easier contracts to move out of the three, in a sense, just because we're not talking about so much money. But obviously, out of the three, I think it's probably fair to say that his plays probably dropped off more than Toews and Kane here as well. A tremendous amount of experience that could be incredibly valuable to another team. And if they could get him at a reduced cap hit, really, it could be a tremendous pickup. You look at the direction the Maple Leafs are going right now, adding a few veterans to kind of work with the young players and have some extra leadership there. That type of thing. Except the only difference is the veterans that the Leafs have added don't have that pedigree of being a Stanley Cup champion. Like, obviously, Wayne Simmons Jason Spezza and Joe Thornton have not won the Stanley Cup. They're trying to do so together with their hometown team. But in the case of these Blackhawk veterans, we have multiple championships under their belts, and they have a whole different level of experience here. So to me, that has even more value. So if there's value for those other players, there's value for these guys. But the problem is the price tag that comes with it. But if Duncan Keith, if the Blackhawks were to consider trading him at 50% retention, and a team could get him, $2.25 million for a few years, that to me has tremendous value, and I think teams would be willing to offer up, some draft picks in order to make that acquisition. Now, Toews and Kane signed matching contracts, $10.5 million. They also have 3 years left on their deal. Toews is 1 year older than Kane, but Patrick Kane is still an 80-point player. Definitely the strongest out of the three, there's no doubt. So I think there would be the most interest in Kane out of the three for an acquisition. It's just a lot of money to take on. And you take a look at Jonathan Toews, who's had an incredible career in the NHL and internationally. A tremendous amount of experience, could be invaluable to many franchises trying to get over the hump. He's still, pretty consistent around that 60-point plateau. And we saw playoff Jonathan Toews this past year against the Edmonton Oilers be a point-per-game player, be a real difference maker. And he's still got some hockey in him, and I'm not convinced that there wouldn't be a lot of teams interested in that as well. Again, though, the price tag is the problem. If the Blackhawks are willing to retain some salary on these players, why not consider moving them? At the end of the day, though, the Hawks have a ton of money tied up in these three players over the next 3 years. Obviously, any rebuild needs veterans to kind of show the kids the way, be great role models and mentors and leaders for them. So maybe they don't get moved out, and I'm not convinced that all three will. But you just, based on how the verbiage was that they're committed to building, young players and trying to build this team up again so they can really be contenders again for years to come and basically try to put together another dynasty like they basically did with the 3 Stanley Cups that they won before. I mean, that's not going to be easy to do when you have, $10.5 million on one player, another $10.5 on another, and $5.5 on another. I mean, that's a lot of money. We're looking at, $26.5 million on 3 players. And you're going to have all kinds of these kids that are coming out of their ELCs here in the next few years that are going to be looking for raises. Kubalik signed a pretty good contract. He's going to want more soon. You got the Dylan Strome contract coming up. You have other players that are going to be going through their ELCs like Kirby Dach, who could get a big-time contract. And you're going to need that flexibility. The Blackhawks also need to sort out their goaltending longer term as well. So clearly, it really boils down to if these veterans want to stick around and be a part of the solution here and try to help them get the next generation of Blackhawks players to a point where they can contend, or do they want to go contend somewhere else and be a part of possibly additional championships somewhere else? Because it looks as though the Blackhawks won't be anywhere near it, at least for the remainder of their contracts. I mean, you can't help but wonder with a guy like Patrick Kane. Obviously, he's from the Buffalo area. The idea of him playing with Jack Eichel for a long time, because I still think Kane has a lot of game in him. The Sabres do have some flexibility as well, especially if you knock some money off that contract because of retention on Chicago's part. That sounds pretty intriguing. Jonathan Toews, could he go home to Winnipeg? He's a Winnipeg, Manitoba boy. They certainly could use him in their lineup right now. That's an intriguing thought for sure. So, I mean, you get Duncan Keith. There's a variety of teams, especially if you can get him at $2.5-3 million. Who wouldn't want that valuable experience on the back end for a couple of years at that price tag? So I really don't think there'd be a huge amount of difficulty trading these players in a sense, because there would be lots of interest. It's just a matter of where they can go to make it work. But you start retaining some salary, makes things a lot easier, and you could see this whole team kind of take a whole different direction. Now, besides those 3, I don't think there's a ton of players out there on the Hawks that would be moved besides the ones we already saw leave. Except we already saw Crawford and Saad go, which had value. Maybe Kelvin Hansel, probably one of the other few guys, or maybe a Zach Smith. Smith hasn't been there all that long, was injured a lot last year. He's only got 1 year left at 3.25. So, if he doesn't go, he's done next year anyway. You got Kelvin Hansel's a few years left, though, at $4.5 million. He's 29. He's had a lot of injuries. It might be tough to move, but if you can find a taker for DeHaan, you probably do that. Make some room for guys like Boakfist and Mitchell on the back end. Make sure that they get more opportunity as well. And obviously you go from there. You don't know the future of Brent Seabrook, but at this point, I don't really think that's something you can do much with regardless of what happens. So let me know your thoughts on the whole Hawks rebuild. Will we see any of their veteran guys be moved? Where do you think would be great landing spots for them? And give me some mock trades down in the comments so we can discuss further. If you're new to the channel, consider subscribing and turning on your notifications so you don't miss any future content. And give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. I'd appreciate it if you did. As always, thank you for watching, and I'll catch you next time.